It was past 11 on a quiet night in Toledo, Ohio, when flashing lights cut through the dark and pulled over a black government SUV. Behind the wheel, a black woman stayed calm, hands visible, voice steady as she asked why she was being stopped. The officer did not answer. Instead, he escalated, issuing orders, lowering his tone, testing obedience. What he did not know was simple and dangerous. She did not just understand the law. She outranked him in every way that mattered. What happens when authority meets discipline instead of fear? Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Wallace was not the kind of person who looked for attention. In more than 20 years of military service, she had learned that real authority rarely announced itself. It moved quietly, deliberately, and only spoke when necessary. Adrienne had enlisted straight out of college. She rose through the ranks the hard way, assignment by assignment, evaluation by evaluation. 2 combat deployments reshaped her understanding of leadership. In one, she coordinated logistics under constant threat, making decisions that determined whether convoys reached their destination or soldiers went without critical supplies. In another, she oversaw emergency evacuations after an attack, managing chaos with precision while lives depended on her calm. By the time she earned the rank of lieutenant colonel, Adrienne had been responsible for the safety and survival of thousands. She had commanded rooms full of officers twice her size and twice her ego. She had learned how quickly fear could spread, how easily authority could be abused, and how discipline, not volume, was what kept situations from collapsing. That discipline showed in everything she did. Her government-issued black SUV was clean, unmarked, intentionally unremarkable. She dressed simply when off base. No medals. No rank insignia. No need to remind the world who she was. Her power came from training and experience, not from demanding recognition. That night in Toledo, Adrienne had just finished a late meeting 2 hours south of town. She was tired but alert, mind already shifting back toward home and tomorrow's responsibilities. When the cruiser's lights flared behind her, she did not panic. She slowed, signaled, and pulled over exactly as she had been trained to do countless times before. Hands visible. Movements controlled. Voice calm. When the officer approached without greeting and demanded her license, Adrienne immediately noticed the signs. The hand resting too close to the holster. The flashlight angled not to illuminate, but to dominate. The absence of explanation. These were not the behaviors of routine professionalism. These were the markers of escalation. She did not react emotionally because she understood escalation psychology better than most civilians ever would. In the military, she had been trained to de-escalate under pressure, to avoid unnecessary confrontation, to read posture and tone the way others read road signs. She knew that pushing back emotionally, even when wronged, could turn a simple interaction into something dangerous. But there was another layer to her restraint. Adrienne was a black woman in America. That reality had shaped her long before she wore a uniform. She remembered being followed in stores as a teenager. Being asked unnecessary questions at banks. Being treated as suspicious in places where she belonged. Over time, she learned an unspoken rule that many black Americans understand instinctively: one wrong gesture, one sharp tone, one perceived challenge could flip a situation beyond control. That knowledge stayed with her, even after she outranked most people she encountered. So when the officer questioned her, she asked calmly for clarification instead of raising her voice. When he repeated commands instead of answering, she complied slowly and deliberately. When his tone hardened, she did not mirror it. She knew that survival was sometimes about restraint, not righteousness. She also knew documentation mattered. Years of leadership had taught her that systems protected themselves unless confronted with facts. That was why, when the situation crossed from uncomfortable into questionable, Adrienne quietly activated her phone camera. Not as a threat. Not as provocation. As a record. She was not trying to embarrass anyone. She was protecting herself. Inside, she felt the familiar tension of being measured not as an officer, not as a leader, but as a body behind a wheel. She understood that, to the man standing outside her car, she was not a lieutenant colonel. She was not a federal employee. She was simply someone he had decided did not fully belong. Adrienne had spent her life carrying responsibility without demanding recognition. That night, she carried something else as well, the awareness that how she responded could determine whether she went home safely or not at all. She did not know yet that this stop would follow her into a courtroom. But she knew one thing with certainty. She would not meet power with fear. Sergeant Daniel Mercer had been wearing a badge for 15 years, and over time, the badge had begun to feel less like a responsibility and more like a shield. In the Toledo Police Department, Mercer was known as effective but aggressive. He showed up on time, closed his reports, and never hesitated to act. To supervisors, that often looked like competence. To the people he stopped on the street, it felt very different. Mercer built his reputation on control. He believed hesitation was weakness and questions were disrespect. When someone challenged him, even politely, he heard defiance. And defiance, in his mind, had to be crushed early before it spread. The department culture allowed it. Complaints against Mercer had come in before. Not enough to get him fired. Not enough to slow his career. Just enough to create a pattern that everyone quietly acknowledged and then ignored. Excessive tone. Unnecessary escalation. Stops that felt personal instead of professional. Each time, the same result followed. The report was reviewed. The language was softened. The case was closed. Colleagues knew Mercer had an edge. Some avoided riding with him. Others laughed it off. A few younger officers watched and learned. Silence became policy. The union stood ready whenever a complaint surfaced, reframing incidents as misunderstandings, reminding leadership that Mercer was one of the productive ones. Over time, Mercer internalized the message. The system had his back. The badge was enough. On the night he pulled over Adrienne Wallace, Mercer was bored. The shift had been slow. No calls. No action. When he saw the unfamiliar black SUV pass his usual spot, he didn't see a routine driver. He saw something different. Something out of place. That was enough for him. He activated his lights before fully articulating why. By the time the SUV pulled over smoothly, Mercer had already decided the tone of the encounter. This was going to be his stop. He approached the driver's side without greeting, hand near his holster, flashlight aimed directly at her face. He didn't explain the reason for the stop. Explanation invited questions. Questions invited challenge. When Adrienne asked calmly why she had been stopped, Mercer heard it as resistance. The fact that she asked instead of immediately complying irritated him. In his mind, authority was not supposed to be questioned. He claimed lane drifting. A vague justification. Just enough to proceed. When she complied slowly and deliberately, Mercer interpreted calm as calculation. He watched her movements closely, not for safety, but for leverage. When she mentioned the vehicle was government-issued and that she was a federal employee, something in him tightened. That wasn't reassurance. That was, to him, an attempt to assert status. Mercer didn't back down. He stepped closer. His voice dropped into a sharper register. He ordered her out of the vehicle. There was no clear probable cause for a sobriety test. No slurred speech. No smell of alcohol. No erratic behavior. But Mercer didn't need cause in the way civilians understood it. He needed compliance. And he wasn't getting it fast enough. When Adrienne asked for clarification, Mercer escalated. Questions became refusal in his mind. Refusal justified force. He opened the door himself. At that moment, Mercer stopped seeing a person. He saw a challenge to his authority. And in his world, challenges had to be met head-on. He directed her through a field sobriety test under harsh streetlights, even after she performed perfectly. No stumbles. No hesitation. No evidence of impairment. Still, he wasn't satisfied. He issued a citation anyway, not because the violation mattered, but because he needed the stop to end on his terms. Throughout the encounter, Mercer never once adjusted his approach. He never paused to reassess. He never asked himself whether escalation was necessary. He was operating on instinct shaped by years of reinforcement. When he pushed, the system usually pushed back in his favor. What Mercer didn't see was the quiet discipline on the other side of the stop. He didn't recognize training when he saw it. He mistook restraint for submission and professionalism for weakness. To him, Adrienne Wallace wasn't a human being with a career of service and responsibility. She was a driver who asked too many questions. A woman who didn't move quickly enough. A presence that didn't automatically defer. And that, in Mercer's worldview, was unacceptable. He drove away from the stop convinced it was over. Just another citation. Just another show of control. He logged the interaction, docked his body camera, and moved on with his shift, unaware that for the first time in 15 years, the badge would not be enough to protect him. Because this time, the system was about to look back. The moment Adrienne Wallace turned on her phone camera, the entire encounter shifted. It was a small movement. Deliberate. Unhurried. Her hand moved toward her phone, her voice steady as she spoke aloud what she was doing. She did not accuse. She did not threaten. She simply stated a fact. This interaction is being recorded. For the first time since the lights came on, Sergeant Daniel Mercer hesitated. It wasn't dramatic. Just a fraction of a second. A pause most people would miss. His eyes flicked to the phone. His jaw tightened. Somewhere behind the confidence and the posture, a calculation briefly surfaced. Cameras changed things. Cameras created records. Records outlived badges. But the pause passed. Mercer chose momentum over caution. His voice hardened instead of softening. It took on a tone Adrienne recognized immediately. Not the tone of public safety. The tone of instruction. Of correction. Of a man convinced he was about to teach someone a lesson. Out of the vehicle, he repeated, louder this time. Slower. As if volume and pace could force obedience. His hand hovered closer to his holster now. Not gripping it. Not drawing. But close enough to send a message. Close enough to remind her where power, in his mind, lived. The flashlight beam no longer searched. It pinned. Adrienne stepped out exactly as instructed. Her posture was upright. Her movements controlled. She didn't argue. She didn't rush. She didn't give him anything he could twist into justification. That restraint was not accidental. It was training. She knew that the camera did not protect her by itself. Her behavior did. The record mattered only if it showed truth without distortion. She understood how quickly a raised voice could be labeled aggression. How easily frustration could be framed as resistance. So she gave Mercer nothing but facts. Mercer guided her through a field sobriety test that never should have happened. His instructions were clipped, condescending. He spoke slowly, as if explaining basic concepts to a child. Each word carried the same underlying message. I am in charge here. You will comply. She complied. Heel to toe. Counted steps. Turned on command. Held her balance. Passed every measure without hesitation. The camera captured it all. The silence between instructions. The lack of impairment. The absence of cause. Still, Mercer wasn't finished. He wrote the citation deliberately, pen pressing harder than necessary into the paper. He narrated his authority as he worked, explaining consequences, reminding her that cooperation was expected, that attitude mattered. Not once did he acknowledge that she had done everything right. Adrienne accepted the ticket without comment. Her eyes stayed level. Her hands steady. Inside, she noted details the camera couldn't fully capture. The tension in his shoulders. The way his voice rose when she asked neutral questions. The subtle shift when he realized he was being documented and decided to push anyway. This was the moment the encounter stopped being personal and became institutional. From Mercer's perspective, the camera was an annoyance. A challenge to his control. He believed the badge would outlast the footage. It always had. He had seen complaints dissolved before. Videos buried. Narratives rewritten. From Adrienne's perspective, the camera was not a weapon. It was accountability. She wasn't recording to provoke him. She was recording because she understood systems. She understood that memory faded and authority rewrote events. She understood that without evidence, power defined truth. The stop ended without arrest. Mercer returned to his cruiser convinced he had asserted dominance. Another driver corrected. Another challenge neutralized. Adrienne returned to her vehicle and drove away, heart rate steady, mind already cataloging what had happened. She did not cry. She did not call anyone immediately. She let the adrenaline pass. She let the facts settle. What Mercer did not realize was that something fundamental had changed. This was no longer a question of interpretation. No longer his word against hers. The camera had transformed the interaction into a legal artifact. Time-stamped. Verifiable. Immune to revision. Every tone. Every pause. Every unnecessary command. Preserved. The badge had met a lens it could not intimidate. What had started as another late-night stop had become something else entirely. A record. A mirror. A piece of truth that would not move aside simply because someone outranked it on the street. Mercer drove back to his patrol route unaware that the power dynamic had quietly flipped. Adrienne drove on knowing that whatever came next would no longer depend on who spoke louder. It would depend on what was seen. After the stop, Sergeant Daniel Mercer treated the night like any other. He drove back to the station, logged the citation, and dropped his body camera into its charging dock without a second thought. To him, the interaction was finished. Another driver corrected. Another reminder of who controlled the road. In the break room, he mentioned it casually. A quick laugh. A dismissive comment about a woman who tried to pull rank. A few officers nodded. Someone smirked. No one challenged him. That silence felt familiar. Comfortable. Mercer didn't review the footage. He never did unless forced. In his experience, complaints faded if you ignored them long enough. Paperwork was paperwork. The union would handle anything serious. It always had. The system had trained him well. Adrienne Wallace did not go home and let it fade. Back at Fort Wayne, she sat at her desk early the next morning, the video open on her screen. She watched it once, without emotion. Then again, with a legal eye. She noted timestamps. Tone. Proximity. Commands issued without justification. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't editorialize. She simply documented. Adrienne was not angry in the way people expected. She was focused. Years in uniform had taught her that accountability wasn't loud. It was precise. She filed a formal complaint that afternoon. Not just with internal affairs. She sent the footage to the Judge Advocate General's office. To the Inspector General. To legal counsel familiar with civil rights procedure. Each submission was factual, restrained, and supported by evidence. She wasn't looking for media attention. She didn't call reporters. She didn't post the video publicly. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about record. She understood something Mercer never had. Systems did not change when people stayed quiet. They changed when silence was replaced with documentation. Within days, her complaint began moving through channels Mercer had never worried about. Federal ones. Military ones. Offices that didn't answer to local unions or precinct culture. Mercer noticed the shift before he understood it. It started with whispers. A supervisor asking questions that felt different. A request to preserve footage instead of routine storage. A tone that lacked reassurance. Then the envelope arrived. Plain. Official. No department logo. Just his name typed neatly across the front. Inside was a notice of formal inquiry. Language carefully worded. Dates. Case numbers. The complainant identified by name and rank. Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Wallace. Mercer read it twice. Then again. This wasn't a routine complaint. This wasn't internal discipline that could be smoothed over. This was something else. For the first time in 15 years, Mercer felt uncertainty creep in. He laughed it off at first. Told himself it was nothing. A military officer flexing connections. It would pass. It always did. But something felt different. The questions kept coming. Requests for additional documentation. Notices of review. The union rep's confidence was less absolute. The reassurance came slower. Mercer finally watched the footage. Not casually. Not with the bravado he'd carried into every other review. He watched it alone, in silence. He saw himself from the outside for the first time. Heard the tone he'd never questioned. Watched the escalation he'd justified. He didn't see a villain. He saw a man used to being obeyed. And that unsettled him more than anger ever could. Adrienne continued her work uninterrupted. She didn't talk about the case unless asked. She didn't dramatize the experience. To her, this wasn't about revenge. It was about precedent. She thought about every young soldier she mentored. Every civilian who didn't know how to document, who didn't have legal knowledge, who had learned that silence was safer than resistance. She refused to be silent. When Mercer realized this wasn't going away, it was already too late to control the narrative. The system he trusted to absorb consequences had encountered someone who knew how to make it answer. And for the first time, the badge felt lighter than the record. The courtroom was quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if everyone inside understood that what was about to unfold was bigger than a traffic stop. This was not criminal court. No jail sentences hung in the balance. But the weight in the room was unmistakable. This was a civil rights case, and every detail mattered. Sergeant Daniel Mercer sat at the defense table in a suit that didn't quite fit his posture. The badge that once defined him was gone, replaced by a legal pad and whispered conversations with his attorney. Across the aisle, Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Wallace sat beside her counsel, composed and unreadable. No uniform. No insignia. Just presence. The judge called the case to order. The first piece of evidence was simple and devastating. Adrienne's phone video. The screen lit up, and the room watched the encounter unfold in real time. Mercer's tone. His proximity. His refusal to explain the stop. The command to exit the vehicle without clear cause. The unnecessary escalation. No commentary was needed. The footage spoke with a clarity that arguments could not soften. Then came the body camera. This was the moment Mercer's defense had hoped would help him. It didn't. From the officer's own perspective, the jury saw the same pattern. The hand hovering near the holster. The repeated commands. The absence of threat. The field sobriety test administered without justification. The irritation when Adrienne asked neutral, lawful questions. The attorney paused the footage repeatedly, frame by frame. "Here," she said, pointing to the screen. No slurred speech. No erratic movement. No smell of alcohol. And yet the stop escalates. Why? Mercer shifted in his seat. The attorney walked the jury through each decision. Each choice Mercer made. Each opportunity to de-escalate that he ignored. The language used. The posture adopted. The silence where explanation should have been. This was not about a mistake. It was about pattern. Adrienne testified next. She did not dramatize the stop. She did not raise her voice. She spoke the way she had been trained to speak in briefings and debriefings. Clearly. Sequentially. Without emotion clouding the facts. She explained why she turned on the camera. Not to provoke. Not to threaten. But because she understood that documentation was often the only protection available. She described the moment she realized the stop had shifted from routine to unsafe. The tone. The proximity. The sense that compliance was no longer enough. The defense attorney attempted to frame Mercer's actions as discretion under pressure. Adrienne responded calmly. Discretion without discipline is not discretion. It is impulse. Then Mercer took the stand. He looked confident at first. Measured. He spoke about training. About officer safety. About making quick decisions on dark roads late at night. He insisted he followed procedure. The attorney pressed. Sergeant Mercer, if you believed Lieutenant Colonel Wallace was a threat, why did you allow her to complete the stop and leave without arrest? Mercer hesitated. Well, he said slowly, she complied. And yet you escalated. Yes. Why? Mercer shifted again, frustration creeping into his voice. She questioned me. She didn't just do what I asked. And is questioning an officer illegal? No. The attorney paused, then asked the question that would end the defense. Sergeant Mercer, if you had known at the time that Ms. Wallace was a lieutenant colonel in the United States Army, would you have handled the stop differently? The room held its breath. Mercer answered without thinking. Yes. The silence that followed was absolute. His attorney's head snapped toward him. Too late. The plaintiff's counsel repeated the words slowly. So to be clear, Sergeant Mercer. You are saying your treatment of the driver would have changed based on her rank. Mercer swallowed. Yes. That single sentence collapsed every argument he had made. It wasn't about safety. It wasn't about procedure. It was about who he believed deserved respect. The judge took notes. The jury exchanged glances. The verdict came swiftly. The court found that Sergeant Daniel Mercer had violated Lieutenant Colonel Adrienne Wallace's constitutional rights through unlawful detention, unjustified escalation, and abuse of authority. The ruling was entered into permanent public record. The case was forwarded to the Department of Justice for further review. Mercer stared straight ahead as the decision was read. There was no outburst. No apology. Just the quiet realization that the badge had not been enough this time. Adrienne did not celebrate. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Not in victory, but in acknowledgement. This was what she had come for. Not money. Not headlines. A precedent. A documented moment where authority had been forced to answer for itself. As the courtroom emptied, Adrienne gathered her files and walked out without comment. The system had spoken. And for once, it had listened to someone who refused to disappear into silence. The verdict did not end the story. It exposed it. Within weeks, Sergeant Daniel Mercer was placed under formal internal investigation. His personnel file, once buried under routine evaluations and quiet approvals, was reopened line by line. Supervisors were questioned. Prior complaints were reviewed. Body camera footage from unrelated stops resurfaced. Patterns that had been ignored now had context. What once looked like isolated incidents began to resemble a consistent misuse of authority. Mercer's career did not collapse overnight, but it fractured. Administrative leave became reassignment. Reassignment became silence. Doors that once opened easily no longer did. The badge that had protected him now felt like a liability no one wanted to carry. The department itself was forced to respond. Policy reviews were ordered. Training procedures were rewritten. Supervisors were instructed to intervene earlier, document more thoroughly, and stop relying on discretion as an excuse for escalation. The court ruling had done more than penalize one officer. It had forced a system to look at itself without filters. Adrienne Wallace returned to Fort Wayne without ceremony. She did not give interviews. She declined speaking invitations from media outlets. Instead, she went back to work. Briefings. Logistics reviews. Training schedules. The routine that had defined her career resumed, steady and unremarkable on the surface. But something had changed. 2 months later, she stood in front of a room filled with new recruits. Young men and women in fresh uniforms, some nervous, some confident, all eager to prove themselves. They expected a lecture on leadership or operations. What they received was something quieter and heavier. Adrienne told them about a road in Ohio at night. About a traffic stop that should have lasted 5 minutes. About how power can distort perception when it is left unchecked. She did not name Mercer. She did not dramatize the moment. She simply said, authority without accountability is just weakness wearing a uniform. The room went silent. She explained that rank does not grant moral superiority. That a badge does not erase bias. That power demands restraint, not dominance. She told them that the most dangerous moments are not when someone is clearly hostile, but when someone feels entitled to control without explanation. You will be questioned, she said. Not because you are wrong, but because people have the right to understand what is happening to them. How you respond in that moment defines who you are. Some recruits shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded. Adrienne reminded them that not everyone they encounter will have a title. Not everyone will have legal training or institutional backing. Most people will only have their voice, their dignity, and the hope that they will be treated fairly. That should be enough, she said. Outside the military, the case continued to ripple outward. Legal training programs cited it. Civil rights workshops used it as a reference. Departments across state lines quietly adjusted their protocols, not because they were ordered to, but because ignoring the lesson had become risky. Adrienne never framed herself as a hero. When asked privately if it was worth it, she answered simply, it needed to be on record. That record mattered. Not because it elevated her, but because it documented something many people experience without witnesses. The moment when authority assumes compliance is owed. The moment when questioning is treated as defiance. The moment when a person is reduced to a problem instead of recognized as human. This story is not about rank meeting rank. It is about power meeting discipline. It is about what happens when someone refuses to disappear quietly, not by shouting, but by documenting, following procedure, and demanding accountability. If you have ever been treated like you did not belong where you were standing, this story is for you. If you have ever been told, directly or indirectly, that respect must be earned through credentials instead of humanity, this story is for you. And if you want to keep hearing stories that strip away the illusions of power and reveal what accountability really looks like, follow Justice Unmasked. Because the truth does not always arrive loudly. But when it is recorded, it lasts.